Welcome, everyone. Today, we are diving into the core vocabulary of NCERT Class 12 Psychology. Psychology is unique because it names the things we experience every day but rarely think about, like why we can read misspelled sentences or how we learn habits. In this discussion, we will break down these essential terms, look at real-world examples, and see how these concepts connect to explain the human mind. Here is the comprehensive list of definitions directly based on the provided glossary text, along with illustrative everyday examples to clarify each concept. A1. Absolute threshold. Definition: the minimum intensity necessary for a stimulus to be detected. For example, detecting the ticking of a wristwatch in a completely silent room from 20 feet away. 2. Achievement need, motive. Definition: the need to succeed, perform better than others, excel, and take on challenging tasks that demonstrate a person's ability. For example, an athlete training rigorously every single day to break a school record and win a championship. 3. Adolescence. Definition: the developmental period of transition from childhood to early adulthood, starting at approximately 11 to 12 years of age and ending at 18 to 20 years of age. For example, a 15-year-old student navigating high school, shifting peer dynamics, and changes in identity. 4. Aerial perspective. Definition: a monocular cue to depth perception consisting of the relative clearness of objects under varying atmospheric conditions. Nearer objects are usually clearer in detail and color, whereas farther objects are less distinct. For example, looking out at a mountain range and noticing that the closest peaks look sharp and vivid, while distant peaks look hazy and bluish. 5. Animism. Definition: a facet of pre-operational thought. The belief that inanimate objects have lifelike qualities and are capable of action. For example, a toddler apologizing to a teddy bear after dropping it, believing the bear's feelings are hurt. 6. Anxiety. Definition: a general feeling of apprehension or dread accompanied by predictable physiological changes. For example, feeling your heart race and your palms sweat right before walking on stage to deliver a public speech. 7. Arousal. Definition: a physiological state of the body. For example, a surge in heart rate and adrenaline when you suddenly hear a loud bang outside your window. 8. Artificial intelligence, AI. Definition: the field concerned with creating machines, e.g., computers, that can perform complex tasks formerly considered to require human intelligence. For example, a computer program analyzing complex medical scans to accurately diagnose diseases. 9. Associative learning. Definition: learning that certain events occur together. The events may be two stimuli, as in classical conditioning, or a response and its consequences, as in operant conditioning. For example, a dog learning to associate the sound of a rustling treat bag with getting food, causing it to run to the kitchen. 10. Attachment. Definition: a close emotional bond between the infant and the parents or caregiver. For example, a baby crying when their mother leaves the room and immediately calming down when she returns and holds them. 11. Attribution. Definition: inference about an individual's internal state based on the perception of external factors, cues. For example, seeing a coworker slamming a door and assuming they are angry about a recent meeting. 12. Authoritative parenting. Definition: a parenting style in which parents encourage children to be independent but still place limits and control on their actions. For example, a parent allowing their teenager to go to a friend's party but setting a strict curfews and explaining the safety reasons behind it. B1. Basic emotions. Definition: feeling states common to the human species from which other feeling states are derived. For example, experiencing pure joy when receiving good news or immediate fear when facing danger. 2. Behavior genetics. Definition: the study of the power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. For example, researching identical twins raised apart to determine if their shared personality traits stem from genetics or their environments. 3. Behavior. Definition: any covert or overt action, reaction a person or animal does that can be observed in some way. For example, smiling at a passing stranger, overt, or your heart rate accelerating out of excitement, covert. 4. Behaviourism. Definition: a school of thought that emphasizes objectivity, observable behavioral responses, learning, and environmental determinants. For example, a teacher using a system of gold stars to reward students for staying quiet, focusing entirely on how the external reward alters their actions. 5. Bilingualism. Definition: the acquisition of two languages that use different speech sounds, vocabularies, and grammatical rules. For example, a child growing up speaking Spanish fluently at home with parents and English at school with teachers. 6. Binocular cues. Definition: depth cues, such as retinal disparity and convergence, that depend on the use of two eyes. For example, holding a finger up right in front of your nose and noticing it shifts positions dramatically when you close one eye at a time. 7. Biofeedback. Definition: a procedure that permits individuals to monitor their own physiological processes, e.g., heart rate, blood pressure, which they are normally unaware of, to learn to control them. For example, watching a digital monitor track your heart rate and intentionally taking slow, deep breaths to bring the numbers down. 8. Bottom-up processing. Definition: informed perception, progression from individual elements to the whole. For example, looking at a mosaic and analyzing the individual colored tiles before stepping back to see the full image of a face. 9. Brainstorming. Definition: a problem-solving strategy in which an individual or a group collects all possible ideas and evaluates them only after all items have been collected. For example, a marketing team sitting around a table yelling out wild ad concepts for a new product without criticizing any idea until the whiteboard is completely full. C1. Case study. Definition: a technique in which one person is studied in depth. For example, a psychologist spending years interviewing, testing, and tracking a single patient who has a rare form of amnesia. 2. Cell. Definition: the most fundamental unit of a living organism. For example, a single neuron firing signals inside the brain to help process information. 3. Centration. Definition: the focusing or centering of attention on one characteristic to the exclusion of all others. For example, a child insisting that a tall, thin glass has more juice than a short, wide glass, focusing entirely on the height of the liquid while ignoring the width. 4. Cephalocaudal pattern. Definition: the sequence in which the greatest growth occurs at the top, the head, with physical growth in size, weight, and feature differentiation gradually working from top to bottom. For example, a baby learning to control their head movements and facial expressions long before they develop the coordination to sit up or walk. 5. Chronological age. Definition: the number of years that have elapsed since a person's birth. What is usually meant by age? For example, celebrating a person's 21st birthday because exactly 21 years have passed since they were born. 6. Chunking. Definition: a group of familiar stimuli stored as a single unit. For example, memorizing the 10-digit phone number 1,234,567,890 by breaking it into manageable pieces. Definition: 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 0. 7. Classical conditioning. Definition: a type of learning in which an organism learns to associate stimuli. The main feature is that the originally neutral conditioned stimulus, CS, through repeated pairing with the unconditioned stimulus, US, acquires the response originally given to the US. For example, getting nauseous at the sight of a restaurant building, CS, because you previously got food poisoning, US, from eating there. 8. Closure. Definition: organizational process leading to perception of incomplete figures as wholes. For example, looking at a circle drawn with several dashes and immediately perceiving it as a complete, unbroken circle. 9. Cognition. Definition: all the mental activities associated with knowing, namely, perceiving, thinking, and remembering, etc. These are associated with processing, understanding, and communicating information. For example, recalling a recipe, deciding how to substitute an ingredient, and executing the steps to cook a meal. 10. Cognitive approach. Definition: the view that emphasizes human thought and all the processes of knowing is central to the study of psychology. For example, investigating how a person's negative internal interpretations of an event contribute to their feelings of depression. 11. Cognitive learning. Definition: learning that involves reorganization of one's perceptions, knowledge, and ideas. For example, suddenly understanding how a complex math formula works after visualizing it geometrically rather than just memorizing the steps. 12. Cognitive map. Definition: a mental representation of the layout of one's environment. For example, after exploring a maze, rats act as if they have learned a cognitive map of it. For example, navigating your dark house at night to grab a glass of water without turning on the lights because you picture the layout perfectly. 13. Cognitive processes. Definition: processes involving the individual's thought, intelligence, and language. For example, formulating a logical argument during a debate and selecting the right vocabulary words to state your point. 14. Color constancy. Definition: the tendency to perceive a well-known object as being a single color, even if its actual color is modified by changes in illumination. For example, recognizing a red apple as red whether you are looking at it under bright morning sunlight or inside a dimly lit kitchen. 15. Concept. Definition: a general category of ideas, objects, people, or experiences whose members share certain properties. For example, grouping golden retrievers, poodles, and chihuahuas under the overarching mental category of dog. 16. Concrete operational stage. Definition: the third Piagetian stage, lasting approximately from 7 to 11 years of age. In this stage, children can perform logical operations and reasoning on concrete examples but cannot deal with abstract things. For example, a 9-year-old easily solving a basic math problem using plastic blocks, but struggling to grasp purely theoretical algebraic concepts. 17. Conditioned response, CR. Definition: in classical conditioning, the learned or acquired response to a conditioned stimulus, CS. For example, salivating when you hear a lunch bell ring because you've learned it means food is coming. 18. Conditioned stimulus, CS. Definition: a neutral stimulus that, through repeated association with an unconditioned stimulus, becomes capable of eliciting a conditioned response, CR. For example, the specific ringtone on your phone that now triggers excitement because it's only used when your partner calls. 19. Conditioning. Definition: a systematic procedure through which new responses are learned to stimuli. For example, training a puppy to sit by systematically giving it a treat every single time it places its bottom on the floor. 20. Confidentiality. Definition: researchers are responsible for keeping all of the data they collect completely anonymous. For example, a researcher assigns random ID numbers to survey sheets so no one can match a participant's name to their private answers. 21. Confounding. Definition: a term used to describe the operation of variables in an experiment that confuse the interpretation of the data. If the independent variable is confounded with an uncontrolled relevant variable, the experimenter cannot separate the effects of the two variables on the dependent measure. For example, testing a new study method on students in the morning and the old method on students at night. You won't know if better test scores are due to the method or how awake the students felt. 22. Consciousness. Definition: awareness of the general condition of one's mind, awareness of particular mental contents, or self-awareness. For example, being acutely aware of the temperature of the room, your current feelings of boredom, and the text you are reading. 23. Conservation. Definition: a belief in the permanence of certain attributes of objects or situations in spite of superficial changes. For example, flattening a ball of Play-Doh into a pancake shape and knowing that it still contains the exact same amount of clay. 24. Content analysis. Definition: a procedure for analyzing the themes in qualitative data by determining the frequency of specific ideas, concepts, or terms and their relationship. For example, counting how many times words related to anxiety appear in diaries kept by students during finals week to track stress trends. 25. Control group. Definition: subjects in a study who do not receive the special treatment given to the experimental group. For example, in a medical study, the group of patients given a fake sugar pill, placebo, instead of the actual new medication. 26. Control processes. Definition: mechanisms which govern transfer of information from one system of storage to another. For example, actively repeating a new phone number in your head, rehearsal, to move it from sensory memory into short-term storage. 27. Convergent thinking. Definition: thinking that is directed toward one correct solution to a problem. For example, answering a multiple-choice math question on a standardized exam that has exactly one right answer. 28. Correlational research. Definition: research with the goal of describing the strength of the relationship between two or more events or characteristics or variables. For example, gathering data to see if the hours a person spends scrolling social media relate to their self-reported levels of happiness. 29. Creativity. Definition: the ability to think in novel and unusual ways and to come up with unique solutions to problems. For example, an engineer designing a brand new, eco-friendly water purification device using everyday items like plastic bottles and sand. 30. Culture. Definition: the widely shared customs, beliefs, values, norms, institutions, and other products of a community that are transmitted socially across generations. For example, the traditional practice, etiquette, and values passed down through generations surrounding Japanese tea ceremonies. D1. Data. Definition: qualitative and quantitative information related to mental processes and behavior, gathered from individuals. For example, a spreadsheet tracking the heart rates, quantitative, and written journal entries, qualitative, of 50 study participants. 2. Debriefing. Definition: the procedure for informing a participant of the actual intent of an experiment after its successful completion. It is specially required if the participant was seriously misled during the conduct of experiment. For example, an experimenter explaining to a participant that a fake test was used to see how they react to pressure, clearing up the deception once the study ends. 3. Decision-making. Definition: the process of evaluating alternatives and making choices among them. For example, weighing the pros and cons of two different job offers, looking at salary, location, and hours, and picking one. 4. Deductive reasoning. Definition: reaching a conclusion by accepting the premises of an argument and then following the formal logical rules. For example, starting with, all humans are mortal, and Socrates is human, and logically concluding that Socrates is mortal. 5. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. Definition: the genetic material of the cell, located in the nucleus. For example, the double helix strands within a cell that carry the instructions for your eye and hair color. 6. Dependent variable. Definition: the factor that is measured in an experiment. It changes because of the manipulation of the independent variable. For example, the test scores of students at the end of a study, measured to see if a new teaching style worked. 7. Depth perception. Definition: the perception of the distance of an object from the observer or the distance from front to back of a solid object. For example, judging exactly how far away an oncoming car is before deciding to cross the street. 8. Development. Definition: it is the pattern of progressive, orderly, and predictable changes that begin at conception and continue throughout life. For example, tracking a child's predictable transition from crawling to standing to taking their very first steps. 9. Difference threshold. Definition: the minimum difference between a pair of stimuli that can be perceived. For example, holding a 10-pound weight and noticing the tiny addition of weight only when it reaches 10.5 pounds. 10. Discrimination. Definition: in classical conditioning, the ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning, responding differently to stimuli that signal a behavior will be reinforced or will not be reinforced. For example, a dog wagging its tail at the specific sound of its owner's car engine, but ignoring all other passing cars. 11. Divergent thinking. Definition: thinking that meets the criteria of originality, inventiveness, and flexibility. It calls for thinking in different directions, searching for a variety of answers to questions that can have several answers, and is characteristic of creativity. For example, coming up with 20 alternative uses for a simple paperclip, such as using it as a bookmark, a hook, or a makeshift zipper pull. 12. Divided attention. Definition: the process by which attention is split between two or more sets of stimuli. For example, listening closely to a podcast while simultaneously chopping vegetables for dinner. 13. Dyslexia. Definition: a general term referring to difficulty in reading. For example, a bright child who struggles to match printed letters on a page to their corresponding spoken sounds, causing slow reading speeds. E1. Echoic memory. Definition: a momentary sensory memory of auditory stimuli. If attention is elsewhere, sounds and words can still be recalled within 3 or 4 seconds. For example, when you ask, "What did you say?" only to realize you can instantly replay the last few words the speaker uttered in your head. 2. Egocentrism. Definition: a salient feature of pre-operational thought, which refers to the inability to distinguish between one's own perspective and someone else's perspective. For example, a young child covering their own eyes and thinking that because they can't see you, you can't see them either. 3. Elaborative rehearsals. Definition: the linking of new information in short-term memory to familiar material stored in long-term memory. For example, remembering the name of a new acquaintance, George, by connecting him to your favorite historical figure, George Washington. 4. Emotion. Definition: complex pattern of changes in response to a situation perceived as personally significant, including physiological arousal, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. For example, winning a massive prize, leading to your heart racing, arousal, feelings of intense joy, thoughts of how it changes your life, and jumping up and down, behavior. 5. Encoding. Definition: the process of recording information into the memory system for the first time. For example, paying close attention to a new teacher's name on the first day of school so your brain registers it. 6. Environment. Definition: the aggregate of external conditions, physical, biological, social, and cultural, that influence the functions of the organism. For example, growing up in a quiet, rural town surrounded by nature, which shapes your daily habits and peaceful disposition. 7. Episodic memory. Definition: LTM component that stores autobiographic information coded for reference to a timeframe for past occurrences. For example, vividly remembering the exact details, sights, and feelings of your high school graduation ceremony. 8. Esteem needs. Definition: in Maslow's theory, needs for prestige, success, and self-respect. They can be fulfilled after belongingness and love needs are satisfied. For example, seeking a promotion at work to earn recognition from peers and build a sense of professional competence. 9. Evolution. Definition: the theory proposed by Charles Darwin that over time organisms originate and change in response to adaptational demands of their unique environments. For example, a species of bird developing longer, Thinner beaks over many generations to reach insects hiding inside deep tree bark. 10. Experiment. Definition: a series of observations conducted under controlled conditions to investigate the causal relationship between selected variables. For example, testing if a drug improves memory by giving it to Group A placebo to Group B, keeping all other environmental factors completely identical. 11. Experimental group. Definition: the subjects in a study who receive some special treatment in regard to the independent variable. For example, the group of participants who take the actual experimental sleep aid pill in a study tracking sleep quality. 12. Explicit memory. Definition: memory of facts and experiences that one can consciously know and declare, also called declarative memory. For example, confidently stating that the capital city of France is Paris during a trivia game. 13. Extinction. Definition: the diminishing of a conditioned response occurs in classical conditioning when an unconditioned stimulus, US, does not follow a conditioned stimulus, CS, occurs in operant conditioning when a response is no longer reinforced. For example, a dog eventually stopping its habit of begging at the table because the family completely ceases handing out scraps of food. F1. Feedback. Definition: information regarding performance on a learning task, also called knowledge of results. For example, a piano teacher telling a student exactly which notes they played flat right after they finish a song. 2. Field experiment. Definition: an experiment carried out in a natural, real-world setting in which variables are manipulated in some manner and observed for their reactions. For example, a researcher subtly changing the layout of a local grocery store aisle to see if it alters real shoppers' purchasing choices. 3. Fine motor skills. Definition: motor skills that involve more finely tuned movements, such as finger dexterity. For example, carefully threading a thin piece of cotton through the tiny eye of a sewing needle. 4. Formal operational stage. Definition: the fourth Piagetian stage in which the individuals move beyond the world of actual or concrete experiences and think in abstract and more logical terms. For example, a teenager debating hypothetical, philosophical scenarios about justice and morality in society. 5. Free recall. Definition: in memory experiments, retrieval of stored items in any order by the participant. For example, being handed a grocery list of 10 items, handing it back, and naming as many items as you can remember in no particular order. 6. Fugue state. Definition: amnesia accompanied by actual physical flight. The person may wander away for several hours or move to another area and establish a new life. For example, a severely stressed individual walking out of their home, traveling to a new town miles away, forgetting their past identity, and taking a new name. 7. Functional fixedness. Definition: the tendency to think of things only in terms of their usual functions, an impediment to problem solving. For example, searching frantically for a screwdriver to tighten a loose screw, completely overlooking a coin sitting right next to you that could do the job. 8. Functionalism. Definition: the school of psychology that emphasized the utilitarian, adaptive functions of the human mind or consciousness. For example, analyzing how habits develop because they help an individual smoothly manage repetitive daily survival tasks. G1. Gender. Definition: the social dimension of being male or female. For example, the societal expectations and cultural roles associated with being a boy or a girl in a specific community. 2. Gender identity. Definition: the sense of being male or female, which most children acquire by the time they are 3 years old. For example, a young child confidently stating, "I am a girl," or "I am a boy," when asked. 3. Gender role. Definition: a set of expectations that prescribe how females and males should think, act, and feel. For example, the cultural expectation that men should avoid crying in public or that women should handle household cooking. 4. Generalization. Definition: the tendency, once a response has been conditioned, for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to evoke similar responses. For example, a child who was bitten by a small terrier suddenly displaying a profound fear of all small dogs, like chihuahuas and pugs. 5. Genes. Definition: the units of hereditary information, short chromosome segments composed of DNA. Genes act as blueprints for cells to reproduce themselves and manufacture the proteins that maintain life. For example, inheriting specific genetic sequences from your parents that dictate your unique height and blood type. 6. Gestalt. Definition: an organized whole. Gestalt psychologists emphasize our tendency to integrate pieces of information into meaningful wholes. For example, looking at an image made entirely of individual ink dots and instantly perceiving the complete shape of a Dalmatian dog. 7. Gestalt psychology. Definition: a branch of psychology in which behavior is viewed as an integrated whole, greater than the sum of its parts. For example, studying a melody as a complete, beautiful experience rather than just analyzing the individual acoustic notes played in isolation. 8. Grammar. Definition is the set of rules indicating how the elements of language may be combined to make intelligible sentences. For example, knowing that in English, you place the adjective before the noun, saying, the blue sky, instead of, the sky blue. 9. Gross motor skills. Definition: motor skills that involve large muscle activities, such as walking. For example, a toddler balancing on 2 legs and kicking a large soccer ball across a playground. 10. Group test. Definition: a test administered to several people at one time by a single tester. For example, a teacher passing out booklets for a college entrance exam to 100 students sitting in a large lecture hall. H1. Heredity. Definition: the biological transmission of traits from parents to offspring. For example, a baby being born with the exact same striking green eye color as their father. 2. Hierarchy of needs. Definition: Maslow's pyramid represents motivational needs in a hierarchy. The more basic needs, such as physiological and safety needs, are at the bottom, followed by the higher-level needs, such as love and esteem, and self-actualization at the top. To move up the hierarchy, a person must have the basic physiological needs met first. For example, a starving person focusing completely on finding bread, physiological, rather than worrying about career prestige, esteem. 3. Homeostasis. Definition: the physiological tendency to maintain an internal, bodily state of balance in terms of food, water, air, sleep, and temperature. For example, your body automatically sweating on a hot day to cool down your internal temperature to normal levels. 4. Homo sapiens. Definition: the scientific nomenclature of modern human beings. For example, the biological term used to categorize every human living on Earth today. 5. Hormones. Definition: chemical substances secreted by glands into the bloodstream. For example, the release of adrenaline into the blood when you encounter a threat, preparing your muscles to run. 6. Humanistic psychology. Definition: the approach to psychology that emphasizes the person, or the self, and personal growth and development. For example, a therapist helping a client realize their unique artistic potential by focusing on self-exploration and positive growth. 7. Hypothesis. Definition: a tentative statement of the relationship between variables as an answer to the research question. For example, stating before an experiment. Definition: students who sleep 8 hours will score higher on exams than students who sleep 4 hours. I1. Identification. Definition: the process of associating oneself closely with other persons and assuming their characteristics or views. For example, a young boy mimicking his older brother's style of walking, talking, and taste in music. 2. Identity versus role confusion. Definition: Erikson's psychosocial developmental stage in which adolescents are faced with conflicts as to who they are, what they are all about, and where they are going in life. Resolution to these leads to identity formation. For example, a high school senior exploring various career paths, hobbies, and social groups to discover who they truly want to be. 3. Illumination. Definition: a stage in the creative process. The idea, solution, or new relationship emerges and all the facts fall into place. For example, staring at a complex puzzle for hours, walking away, and suddenly having the exact solution pop into your head in an aha moment. 4. Incidental learning. Definition: learning that is not deliberate or intentional and which is acquired as a result of some other, possibly unrelated, activity. For example, picking up the lyrics to a popular radio song simply because it plays constantly in the background at your gym. 5. Incubation. Definition: a stage in the creative process. The progress is not apparent at the conscious level. The unconscious mind may work on any idea or solution. For example, taking a long shower or going for a walk to clear your head while your brain silently processes a difficult software bug. 6. Independent variable. Definition: the event or situation manipulated by an experimenter to see if it will have a predicted effect on some other event or situation. For example, the specific dosage of a new focus drug given to a participant to see how it alters their attention span. 7. Individual test. Definition: a test which can be administered to only one person at a time. The Stanford Binet and the Wechsler intelligence tests are examples. For example, a psychologist sitting one-on-one with a child in a quiet room to guide them through a specialized IQ test. 8. Inductive reasoning. Definition: the logical process by which general principles are inferred from particular instances. For example, noticing that every single swan you have ever seen is white, and concluding that all swans must be white. 9. Infancy. Definition: the developmental period extending from birth to 24 months. For example, a 10-month-old baby learning to crawl, babble, and recognize their parents' voices. 10. Information processing approach. Definition: an approach concerned with how individuals process information about their world, how information enters our minds, how it is stored and transformed, and how it is retrieved to perform problem-solving and reasoning. For example, studying how a human brain acts like a computer, taking in visual input, saving it to memory storage, and pulling it up later. 11. Informed consent. Definition: agreement to an experimental or therapeutic procedure on the basis of the subject's or patient's understanding of its nature and possible risks. For example, reading and signing a detailed form that explains exactly what will happen during the psychological study before it starts. 12. Initiative versus guilt. Definition: Erickson's stage of development in which preschool children face a widening social world and are faced with the challenge of developing purposeful behavior to cope with challenges, failure to which leads to development of guilt and shame. For example, a 4-year-old proudly deciding to build a massive tower out of blocks on their own, but feeling ashamed if they knock over a vase in the process. 13. Insight. Definition: the ability to deal effectively with novel situations. For example, instantly figuring out how to use a basic twig to retrieve a ring that slipped down into a narrow wooden floorboard crack. 14. Instinct. Definition: a complex universal behavior that is rigidly patterned throughout a species and is unlearned. For example, a newborn sea turtle immediately crawling toward the ocean waves right after hatching on the beach. 15. Integrity versus despair. Definition: Erickson's 8th and last developmental stage during which individuals look back to evaluate what they have done with their lives. Satisfaction leads to a sense of integrity and dissatisfaction to despair. For example, an 80-year-old looking back at their career and family choices with a warm sense of peace and contentment. 16. Interference. Definition: in learning theory, the activities of the learner, either before, after, or during the learning process interfere with learned material, that cause forgetting. For example, mixing up your old locker combination with your brand new gym locker combination, causing you to forget the correct numbers. 17. Interposition. Definition: a depth perception cue based on the principle that if one object seems to be covering another, it will be perceived as being closer. For example, knowing that a coffee mug is closer to you than your laptop because the mug partially blocks your view of the laptop screen. 18. Interview. Definition: a face-to-face dialogue for the purpose of obtaining information, establishing a diagnosis, assessing interpersonal behavior and personality characteristics, or counseling the individual. For example, a clinical psychologist sitting down with a patient to ask a structured list of questions about their mental health history. 19. Intrinsic motivation. Definition: the internal desire to be competent and to do something for its own sake. For example, painting landscape pictures purely for the joy and creative relaxation it brings you, without trying to sell them. 20. Introspection. Definition: the process of looking inward to one's feelings and conscious experience. For example, sitting quietly and carefully examining your own thoughts to understand exactly why you feel upset after a meeting. J. Judgment. Definition: process of forming opinions, reaching conclusions, and making evaluations based on available material, the product of the evaluation process. For example, reviewing the track records of two political candidates and concluding that one is better suited for office. Juvenile delinquency. Definition: a variety of adolescent behaviors ranging from socially unacceptable behavior to status offenses, such as running away, to criminal offenses, such as theft. For example, a group of 14-year-olds getting caught by police for spray painting graffiti on public property. L1. Language. Definition: a set of symbols that convey meaning, and rules for combining those symbols, that can be used to generate an infinite variety of messages. For example, using spoken English words arranged according to proper syntax rules to write a complex letter. 2. Law of proximity. Definition: grouping law that asserts that nearest stimuli are grouped together. For example, seeing 6 dots arranged as 3 distinct pairs, dollar, quad, quad, dollar, because the dots in each pair are positioned closely together. 3. Law of similarity. Definition: grouping law that asserts that stimuli are grouped together on the basis of common elements. For example, looking at a mixed array of red and blue circles and automatically grouping the red circles together in your mind. 4. Learning disabilities. Definition: children with learning disabilities. 1. Are of normal intelligence or above. 2. Have difficulties in several academic areas but usually do not show deficits in others. And 3. Are not suffering from some other conditions or disorders that could explain their learning problems. For example, a brilliant student who speaks eloquently but struggles immensely with writing words correctly due to a localized deficit. 5. Learning. Definition: a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. For example, mastering how to ride a bicycle through hours of trial, error, and practice until the skill becomes automatic. 6. Linear perspective. Definition: a monocular cue for perceiving distance. We perceive the converging of what we know to be parallel lines as indicating increasing distance. For example, looking down long railroad tracks and seeing the 2 parallel metal rails appear to join together in the far distance. M1. Maintenance rehearsal. Definition: active repetition of information to enhance subsequent access to it. For example, muttering a pizza shop's phone number over and over out loud while you search for a pen to write it down. 2. Maturation. Definition: the orderly sequence of changes dictated by each person's genetic blueprint. For example, a baby naturally developing the leg muscle strength to stand up on their own around 1 year of age. 3. Memes. Definition: are the DNA of human society, influencing every aspect of mind, behavior, and culture. For example, the rapid viral spread of a specific cultural catchphrase, joke, or custom across millions of people online. 4. Menarche. Definition: the first occurrence of menstruation. For example, a 12-year-old girl experiencing her very first monthly menstrual cycle during early puberty. 5. Mental representation. Definition: a mental model of a stimulus or category of stimuli. For example, closing your eyes and picturing a vivid mental image of your childhood bedroom. 6. Mental set. Definition: tendency to respond to a new problem, situation in the manner used for a previous one. For example, trying to pull open every single door you encounter because the last 3 doors you used required pulling, even if the current door clearly says, push. 7. Metacognition. Definition: knowledge and understanding of one's own mental processes. For example, realizing that you learn complex concepts better by looking at diagrams rather than listening to lectures, and modifying your study habits accordingly. 8. Mind. Definition: mind is a concept, which refers to a unique set of an individual's sensations, perceptions, memories, thoughts, dreams, motives, and emotional feelings. For example, the full internal stream of personal memories, current plans, and passing feelings you experience throughout the day. 9. Mnemonics. Definition: strategies or techniques that use familiar associations in storing new information to be more easily retrieved. For example, using the acronym HOMES to remember the 5 Great Lakes: Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. 10. Modeling. Definition: in social learning theory, the process by which a child learns social and cognitive behaviors by observing and imitating others. For example, a young child watching their parent sweep the floor and immediately grabbing a toy broom to mimic the exact motion. 11. Binocular cues. Definition: visual cues from one eye only. For example, judging how far down a road a car is using only the cue that it appears smaller, even if you cover one eye completely. 12. Moral development. Definition: development with respect to rules and conventions about what people should do in their interaction with other people, situations. For example, a child transitioning from avoiding sharing just to escape punishment to actively sharing because they genuinely care about fairness. 13. Morphemes. Definition: the smallest units of meaning in a language. For example, the word unbreakable contains 3 distinct meaningful pieces. Definition: not, break, root word, and able, capable of. 14. Motivation. Definition: a need or desire that energizes and directs behavior. For example, a powerful feeling of dry throat and thirst driving you to stop working and walk to the kitchen for water. 15. Motives. Definition: the factors that direct and energize behavior. For example, the deep-seated urge for affiliation that prompts you to join local clubs and make new friends. 16. Motor development. Definition: the progression of muscular coordination required for physical activities. For example, an infant progressing from randomly waving their arms to intentionally reaching out and grabbing a block. N1. Natural selection. Definition: the evolutionary process that favors individuals of a species that are best adapted to survive and reproduce. For example, light-colored moths becoming rare in a dark forest because predators can easily spot them, while dark moths survive and pass on their genes. 2. Need. Definition: physiological, internal, or environmental, external, imbalance or deficit that gives rise to a drive. For example, a lack of water in the body, dehydration, that sets off a powerful internal signal to drink. 3. Negative correlation. Definition: relationship between 2 variables in which as one variable goes up, the other goes down. For example, as the number of hours you spend practicing a video game increases, the time it takes you to complete a level decreases. 4. Negative reinforcer. Definition: an unpleasant stimulus whose removal leads to an increase in the probability that a preceding response will occur again in the future. For example, the annoying buzzing noise in a car stopping only when you buckle your seatbelt, making you more likely to buckle up instantly next time. 5. Neuropsychology. Definition: it is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes as a function of brain activity and the nervous system. For example, examining how a stroke affecting the left temporal lobe alters a patient's ability to speak coherently. 6. Neurotic disorder. Definition: a psychological disorder that is usually distressing but that allows one to think rationally and function socially. Freud saw the neurotic disorders as ways of dealing with anxiety. For example, a person struggling with a persistent, irrational fear of germs that forces them to wash their hands frequently, though they manage to work a normal office job. 7. Norm. Definition: standard or value, based on measurements of a large group of people, used in interpreting scores on psychological tests. In social psychology, the group standard for approved behavior. For example, lowering your voice to a quiet whisper the second you step inside a library because that is the established rule of the space. 8. Null hypothesis. Definition: a prediction that an experiment will find no difference between conditions or no relationship between variables. For example, stating, definition: there is zero difference in test scores between students who drink coffee before an exam and those who do not. 1. Object permanence. Definition: understanding that objects and events continue to exist even when they cannot directly be seen, heard, or touched. For example, a baby looking underneath a blanket to find a toy car that was intentionally hidden out of sight. 2. Observation. Definition: the intentional examination and recording of an object or process as it occurs. For example, sitting discreetly on a bench at a playground to write down exactly how many times kids share toys. 3. Operant conditioning. Definition: a form of learning in which voluntary responses come to be controlled by their consequences. For example, a student studying harder for exams because their parents give them cash rewards for scoring high grades. 4. Operationism. Definition: the viewpoint that each concept must take its meaning as a single observable and measurable operation. For example, defining the concept of hunger precisely as the number of hours a person has gone without consuming food. 5. Operations. Definition: internalized sets of actions that allow the child to do mentally what was done physically before. For example, a child mentally adding $5 plus $3 in their head instead of physically counting out tokens on a table. P1. Paradigm. Definition: a model or a way of approaching or studying a set of phenomena. For example, shifting from viewing mental illness purely through a biological lens to adopting a holistic biopsychosocial lens. 2. Peers. Definition: children of about the same age or maturity level. For example, a group of 7-year-olds playing a game together during school recess. 3. Perception. Definition: processes that organize sensory information and interpret it in terms of its environmental origins. For example, recognizing a combination of black lines and shapes on paper as a drawing of a house. 4. Perceptual constancy. Definition: the ability, in perception, to draw similar inferences about the world from different patterns of sensory activity, e.g., a person seen from many different angles is still perceived as the same person. For example, knowing a plate is perfectly circular even when it is tilted and casts an oval shape on your eyes. 5. Performance tests. Definition: tests that do not involve language. For example, asking a participant to assemble a complex wooden puzzle within a set time frame without using written instructions. 6. Phenotype. Definition: observable features by which individuals are recognized. For example, a person's physical height, curly hair texture, and brown eye color. 7. Phi phenomenon. Definition: the illusion of movement created by presenting visual stimuli in rapid succession. For example, a neon theater sign where flashing arrow lights turning on one after another look like a single light moving forward. 8. Phonemes. Definition: smallest meaningful units of sound in a language. For example, the basic vocal sounds like dollar, b, dollar, dollar, a, dollar, and dollar, t, dollar that join together to form the word bat. 9. Physiological psychology. Definition: a scientific study of human and animal behavior based on the relationship of physiological processes like those of the nervous system, hormones, sensory organs, and behavioral parameters. For example, testing how changing melatonin levels in mice alters their natural sleep-wake cycles. 10. Positive reinforcement. Definition: a stimulus or event which, when its onset is made contingent on a particular response, increases the likelihood of that response. For example, giving a dog a delicious biscuit immediately after it sits, making it more likely to sit next time you ask. 11. Power motive. Definition: the desire to influence others, to be in charge, and to have status and prestige. For example, a corporate executive working hard to be elected CEO so they can manage the direction of the whole company. 12. Prediction. Definition: one element of the scientific process of describing the relationship between antecedent variables and consequent events. Prediction works forward in time, beginning with measuring the antecedent variables and then anticipating the measures of the consequent events. For example, measuring a student's study hours today to anticipate what their grade will look like on next month's final exam. 13. Prenatal period. Definition: the time from conception to birth. For example, the 9 months a fetus spends growing securely inside the mother's womb. 14. Pre-operational stage. Definition: the second Piagetian stage in which children begin to represent the world with words, images, and drawings but cannot perform operations in a logical manner. For example, a 4-year-old playing make-believe using a simple broom as a magical flying horse, but unable to understand conservation. 15. Primary sex characteristics. Definition: the sexual structures necessary for reproduction. For example, the development and maturation of ovaries or testes during the onset of puberty. 16. Problem solving. Definition: behavior that is at an advanced stage of thinking. It can be divided into 4 stages. Definition: incubation, illumination, preparation, and verification. For example, methodically testing different parts of an electrical circuit to figure out exactly why a lamp won't light up. 17. Proximity principle. Definition: the Gestalt principle, which states that objects or stimuli that are close together will be perceived as a unity. Also called law of proximity. For example, seeing 3 rows of trees rather than individual scattered trees because they are planted tightly together in horizontal lines. 18. Proximodistal trend. Definition: the center outward direction of motor development. For example, an infant learning to control their shoulders and upper arms long before they develop fine control over their fingers. 19. Psychoanalysis. Definition: a method of psychotherapy in which the therapist attempts to bring repressed unconscious material into conscious. For example, a therapist asking a client to talk freely about their childhood dreams to discover hidden emotional conflicts. 20. Psychological motives. Definition: personal and interpersonal motives that lead people to strive for such ends as power, self-esteem, affiliation, and intimacy with other people. For example, joining a local recreational sports league out of a desire to build close friendships and feel a sense of belonging. 21. Psychological test. Definition: a standardized measure of a sample of a person's behavior. For example, taking a timed aptitude test at a career center to evaluate your spatial and logical reasoning abilities. 22. Psychophysics. Definition: study of the relationship between mental processes and the physical world. For example, testing how much you need to increase the physical brightness of a light bulb before a human observer notices the change. 23. Puberty. Definition: a period of rapid skeletal and sexual maturation that occurs mainly in early adolescence. For example, a 13-year-old boy experiencing sudden growth spurts and a deepening voice over the course of a year. 24. Punishment. Definition: the application of an unpleasant, or noxious, stimulus for the purpose of suppressing behavior. For example, taking away a teenager's phone privileges for a weekend to stop them from breaking curfew again. R1. Randomization. Definition: a procedure by which a variable may be selected, assigned, or scheduled, in a completely unbiased manner. Randomization involves the use of the table of random numbers so that no predictable sequence can be established. For example, flipping a coin to decide whether a study participant goes into the experimental drug group or the control group. 2. Reasoning. Definition: realistic thinking process that draws a conclusion from a set of facts. For example, gathering facts about dark clouds, dropping temperatures, and rising humidity to conclude it will likely rain soon. 3. Reinforcement. Definition: an event following a response that strengthens the tendency to make that response. For example, clapping and praising a child every time they clean up their toys, ensuring they keep doing it in the future. 4. Reliability. Definition: a statement about the degree of consistency of a measurement technique. Reliable techniques yield similar measures upon repeated measurement under similar conditions. For example, a bathroom scale showing the exact same weight when you step on it 3 times in a row within 2 minutes. 5. Retrieval cues. Definition: available internal or external stimuli that help in recovering information from storage in the memory system. For example, smelling a specific brand of sunscreen that instantly brings back memories of a beach trip you took years ago. 6. Retroactive interference. Definition: memory process in which newly learned information prevents retrieval of previously stored, similar material. For example, learning your new phone number so well that you suddenly can't recall your old phone number when asked. S1. Schema. Definition: a cognitive structure. A network of associations that organizes and guides an individual's perceptions. For example, having a mental framework for a classroom that automatically includes a whiteboard, desks, chairs, and a teacher. 2. Script. Definition: a memory representation of procedural knowledge, e.g., eating in a restaurant. For example, knowing the expected steps when going to a movie. Definition: buy a ticket, buy popcorn, find your seat, and stay quiet when the film starts. 3. Secondary sex characteristics. Definition: physical features that are associated with gender but that are not directly involved in reproduction. For example, the growth of facial hair on men and the development of wider hips in women during puberty. 4. Selective attention. Definition: the focusing of conscious awareness on a particular stimulus. For example, reading a fascinating novel on a crowded train while completely tuning out the loud conversations around you. 5. Self. Definition: the individual's perception or awareness of herself or himself, of her or his body, abilities, personality traits, and ways of doing things. For example, describing yourself as a calm, artistic person who is great at painting but struggles with public speaking. 6. Self-actualization. Definition: it is a state of self-fulfillment in which people realize their highest potential in their own unique way. For example, a dedicated musician spending their life composing complex symphonies, feeling fully fulfilled by reaching their absolute potential. 7. Self-esteem. Definition: the global evaluative dimension of the self. For example, feeling deeply confident, valuable, and proud of who you are as a human being overall. 8. Semantic memory. Definition: LTM component that stores memory for basic meanings of words and concepts. For example, knowing that a cat is a small, furry, four-legged carnivorous mammal. 9. Sensation. Definition: experience of a physical stimulation. For example, the immediate feeling of intense heat on your skin the moment your finger brushes against a hot stove. 10. Sensorimotor stage. Definition: the first Piagetian stage in which infants construct an understanding of the world by coordinating sensory experiences with physical and motor actions. For example, a 6-month-old baby exploring a new plastic rattle by shaking it loudly and putting it straight into their mouth. 11. Sensory memory. Definition: initial process that preserves brief impressions of stimuli, also called sensory register. For example, the split-second visual trail of light you see in the dark right after waving a glowing sparkler. 12. Serial learning. Definition: the learning of a sequence of responses in the precise order of their presentation. For example, memorizing the precise order of the letters in the alphabet from A all the way to Z. 13. Sex hormones. Definition: substances secreted by the gonads for reproductive functions and determination of secondary sex characteristics, e.g., estrogen in the female and testosterone in the male. For example, a surge of testosterone in a young male adolescent driving the physical growth of facial hair. 14. Shape constancy. Definition: the knowledge that even when an object is viewed from a different angle, its shape remains the same. For example, recognizing a rectangular door remains a rectangle even when it swings wide open and looks like a trapezoid to your eyes. 15. Similarity. Definition: the Gestalt principle, which states that objects or stimuli that are similar in shape, size, or intensity, etc., are perceived as a unit. For example, looking at an array of white and black squares and seeing them grouped as clean columns of white squares and columns of black squares. 16. Size constancy. Definition: a tendency to perceive familiar objects as being the same size even when they cast a different sized image on the retina because of one's distance from them. For example, knowing a friend walking far away from you down the street is still 6 feet tall, even though they look tiny from a distance. 17. Sociobiology. Definition: the systematic study of the biological basis for social behavior. For example, investigating how evolutionary survival traits explain why human communities naturally form protective, cooperative tribal units. 18. Sociology. Definition: study of people in groups. The group rather than the individual is the unit of study. For example, investigating how the entire public school system of a city influences the voting patterns of local neighborhoods. 19. Species. Definition: a biological classification of different living organisms. For example, grouping all domestic dogs together under the single biological classification Canis lupus familiaris. 20. Spontaneous recovery. Definition: in classical conditioning, the reappearance of an extinguished response after a period of non-exposure to the conditioned stimulus. For example, salivating when you unexpectedly hear a childhood school bell years after graduating, even though the response had stopped long ago. 21. Standardization. Definition: a method of establishing norms or standards and uniform procedures for a test by administering it to a large group of representative individuals. For example, giving a new exam to 5,000 students nationwide under identical rules to find out what an average score looks like. 22. Stimulus. Definition: any well-defined element in the environment affecting the organism, which may lead to an overt or a covert response. For example, a sudden flash of lightning in the sky that causes you to instantly blink your eyes. 23. Structuralism. Definition associated with Wilhelm Wundt, the approach to psychology that seeks to understand the structure and operation of consciousness, or the human mind. For example, asking trained observers to meticulously describe the exact sensations and thoughts they experience when they hear a metronome beat. 24. Survey. Definition: a research method utilizing written questionnaires or personal interviews to obtain data of a given population. For example, emailing a standard list of 10 satisfaction questions to 1,000 customers to evaluate opinions on a new service. 25. Syntax. Definition refers to the rules for combining words to form acceptable phrases and sentences. For example, correcting cat the sat mat on to the grammatically sound English structure. Definition: the cat sat on the mat. T1. Temperament. Definition: an individual's behavioral style and characteristic way of responding. For example, a newborn baby who is naturally calm, peaceful, and unbothered by sudden loud noises or new surroundings. 2. Texture gradient. Definition: distance cues based on the fact that objects lose definition and detail the farther away they are. For example, looking down at a pebbled beach and seeing distinct cracks on nearby stones, while distant stones blend into a smooth blur. 3. Thinking. Definition: the mental or cognitive rearrangement or manipulation of both information from the environment and of symbols stored in long-term memory. Language, symbols, concepts, and images are used, and thinking is said to mediate or go between stimuli and responses. For example, mentally planning out the quickest driving route to the grocery store while taking current heavy traffic reports into consideration. 4. Top-down processing. Definition: informed perception, a progression from the whole to the elements. For example, reading a sentence with misspelled words easily because your brain uses the overall context of the sentence to guess the individual letters. 5. Trace decay theory. Definition: the idea that learned material leaves in the brain a trace or impression, which eventually disappears unless it is practiced and used. For example, forgetting a foreign vocabulary word you learned in middle school because you haven't spoken the language in 10 years. 6. Traumatic experience. Definition: an injury, either physical or psychological. Psychological traumas include emotional shocks that have a more or less permanent effect on the personality, such as rejection, divorce, combat experience, civilian catastrophes, etc. For example, surviving a major earthquake, leading to long-term anxiety and fear whenever you hear low rumbling sounds. 7. Trust versus mistrust. Definition: Erikson's first psychosocial stage. Development of a sense of trust requires a feeling of physical comfort and a minimal amount of fear and apprehension about the future. For example, a tiny infant learning that the world is a safe place because their parents consistently feed and comfort them whenever they cry. U1. Unconditioned response. Definition: the unlearned or involuntary response to an unconditioned stimulus. For example, automatically pulling your hand away and gasping when you accidentally touch a sharp, painful thorn. 2. Unconditioned stimulus. US. Definition: a stimulus that normally produces an involuntary measurable response. For example, a sour lemon slice placed directly on your tongue that automatically forces your mouth to produce saliva. 3. Unobtrusive measures. Definition: observation and measurement procedures specifically selected not to interfere with the natural behavior or enter the conscious awareness of the subject. For example, counting the amount of wear and tear on floor tiles in front of a museum exhibit to see how popular it is, without bothering visitors. V. 1. Validity. Definition: the ability of a test to measure what it was designed to measure. For example, a bathroom scale accurately measuring your body weight in pounds rather than accidentally measuring your height. 2. Variable. Definition: any measurable conditions, events, characteristics, or behaviors that are controlled or observed in a study. For example, tracking room temperature, study time, or test scores during an educational experiment. 3. Verbal learning. Definition: the process of learning to respond verbally to verbal stimuli, which may include symbols, nonsense syllables, and lists of words. For example, practicing flashcards to memorize a long list of new Spanish nouns alongside their English translations. 4. Verbal test. Definition test in which a subject's ability to understand and use words and concepts is important in making the required responses. For example, taking a vocabulary exam where you must write out the formal definitions for 20 complex vocabulary words. 5. Visual illusions. Definition: physical stimuli that consistently produce errors in perception. For example, staring at the Muller-Lyer lines and perceiving one line as longer than the other, even though they are identical in length. W1. Word associations. Definition: personality assessment techniques in which an individual generates responses triggered by common words. For example, a psychologist saying the word mother, and the patient immediately responding with the very first word that pops into their head. Definition: home. 2. Working memory. Definition: memory processes that preserve recently perceived events or experiences, also called short-term memory. For example, holding a series of numbers in your mind while actively multiplying them together to figure out a tip amount. That brings us to the end of our glossary review. Going through these terms together really highlights the major themes of the curriculum, like Piaget's cognitive stages, behavioral conditioning, and memory processes. Having both the definitions and the real-world examples down should make applying these concepts much easier. Good luck with the rest of your studying. If this breakdown helped you better encode these concepts into your long-term memory, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more psychology study guides.